Dr. Peter Moore is an Australian independent researcher. He specializes in Irish and Australian legal history. His most prominent work is the Dictionary of Biography of NSW Lawyers to 1861.
The paper he will read today is entitled Clann Chief Son as Colonizer of New Caledonia, 1839-1842. It deals with an Irishman planning New Caledonia's colonization.
Let me begin by agreeing with so many speakers at this conference that the Celtic can be found everywhere. And now let me try to identify it and measure it in one particular instance, to ask if and how the Celtic, in particular the Irish Gaelic form, might operate across centuries and empires. Now, the Celtic means many things to many people. Ideally, it will mean a new slide. That one? Ah, okay. Right, okay, sorry, thank you. Yes, so Celtic means many things to many people. Scholars understand it as art, language and literature, through archaeology, linguistics and paleography, and it has popular meanings too, as memorabilia, tattoos, pubs, and even football teams. This paper takes a position somewhere between the two. It follows an idea of the Celtic out of Ireland, into India, onto Australia, and traces it to New Caledonia. The Pacific Ocean, too, can be a Celtic realm. Simply having Irish, Scottish and Welsh origins might be sufficient to be Celtic. Even so, the colonisation of New Caledonia by the scion of an Irish clan chieftain might come as a surprise. Major Benjamin Sullivan was such a scion of the millennial dynasty of the O'Sullivan More, O'Sullivan Grand. And not once but 3 times he proposed to establish a British colony on the island of New Caledonia. Prospectuses issued by him between 1838 and 9 and 1842 expressed his plans in terms imperial, strategic and capitalist. Imperially, the triangle formed by New South Wales, New Zealand and New Caledonia must be Britain's. Strategically, Port St. Vincent would outdo Sydney Harbour as a naval station and become the central point of rendezvous for steam communication between England and Australasia and Asia via America. The island's acquisition also promised great profits for the United Kingdom. The astonishingly fertile island was predicted to become the Jamaica of the East. Capitalism was the vehicle for his scheme. The final form of his prospectus, dated the 24th of May, 1842, Queen Victoria's birthday, prescribed a corporation to be called the Victoria Company, which would turn the island into the colony of Victoria. The Crown would grant the company a charter and convey to it the entire island of New Caledonia to encourage investors to subscribe £3 million in £50 shares to colonise it. Sullivan claimed to practice the lost art of colonisation, especially the ancient Greek principle of forecast and completeness, rather than the loose scramble which left too many factors to chance in the settlement of Australia and New Zealand. He felt sure the project would prove 2 things. First, that colonisation can be carried out both beneficially and systematically from its commencement, subject to the full control of the Crown. And second, that it can be done without putting Her Majesty's government to any expense. To these ends, Sullivan's proposal provided 22 pages of detailed estimates which calculated like clockwork how capital would be raised, officers deployed, expenses met, and revenues applied. Separate public service establishments were dedicated to particular purposes: civil, customs, surveying, medical, ecclesiastical, sheriff and police, military, judiciary, commerce, postage, agriculture, leasing, mining, marine, fishing, manufacturing, architecture, building and engineering. He'd thought of everything. He even provided for museums, repositories of the arts, public libraries, and public places of scientific and botanical recreation. Revenue streams were predicted from the company's local enterprises and from leasing lands to settler farmers. Steam passage boats, coal depots, and whaling would be conducted from London as separate businesses. Strong emphasis was given to supporting the Protestant Episcopalian Church, providing for royal judges and a range of courts, and maintaining military forces. Sullivan spilled less ink on acquiring sovereignty over the island and understanding the wishes of the islanders. On both counts, he was brief and imprecise, above all, presumptuous. England, he contended, has the same right of sovereignty over the island as she possessed over New Zealand, a proposition the British government had spent 10 years trying to evade. It was both her duty and her interest to have the island colonised as soon as possible, to avoid the evils and the difficulties that preceded and attended the recent occupation of New Zealand. He warned that the islanders were warlike and well skilled in archery, and that they had given little or no indication of amity to recent visitors. Any opposition he would pass to the military and the church. Army units would deliver a display of armed force to resolve any objections, although he urged great precaution to prevent unnecessary shedding of blood. To Church of Ireland missionaries, he left the task of conciliating the islanders to British authority and customs. Even so, 15 years in New South Wales had convinced Sullivan that if the islanders were anything like Australia's Aborigines, they would be easily dealt with. Efforts to Christianise Aborigines were, he claimed, wasted upon adults, and resolved from the start to take New Caledonian children from their families and train them for an honest livelihood, simultaneously achieving conversion and civilization. He did not, anyway, highlight a role for islanders. He preferred to import labourers from East India Company lands and elsewhere until sufficient Europeans were acclimatised to do the work themselves. On both counts, offering little sign of Irish benevolence in the colonising project. Remember that New Caledonia's association with Europe had scarcely begun when Sullivan conceived his grand project in 1838, and when he published the final form in 1842, that impact was still scarcely felt. He'd certainly studied carefully the precedents for company colonisation. A London board to control the venture, with the governor on the ground, aped the Hudson's Bay Company and the East India Company from past times. More recent examples included the Australian Agricultural Company and the Van Diemen's Land Company from the 1820s, and the South Australian and New Zealand Land Companies of the 1830s. They assumed three things in common. First, the Crown would obtain sovereignty over a territory, and second, the Crown would grant or sell its broadacres to a company for development by its own personnel and for resale to settlers. Third, all assumed that the ventures would pay for themselves. The key difference was that since the East India Company, colonisation companies were never granted control of an entire land, just some grant or portion within another territory. Models for failure were also in sight. The South Australian colony, opposed by successive governments for its novelty and rapacity, was bankrupt by 1841 and was bailed out by legislation passed in London while Sullivan's prospectus circulated in Sydney. Timing was crucial too. Sullivan's efforts to colonise New Caledonia were probably prompted by other projects of his own. The first, in 1838, coincided with a new British military outpost on Australia's northern coast, near Darwin, to protect the sea lanes from Asia to the Pacific. His next attempt, in 1840, drew conclusions from the voyage of HMS Favourite that the island of New Caledonia is admirably suited for the purposes of colonisation. Larger factors also played a part. Sullivan's analysis of the island's geography, climate and potential for trade and commerce mounted the latest of a strategic contest, the latest round of a strategic contest between Britain and France. His plan to raise £3 million, however, clashed with a London money market crisis. The Tory government tightened fiscal policy, investment in colonies dried up, free emigration was halted, and colonial economies became depressed. The prospectus had its own precedents. Its form and substance, and much of its prose, were borrowed from his Eastern Australian schemes. Developed substantially further, the earlier details were altered appropriately, supported by a similar array of costings, offices, and profit projections. Don't worry, public opinion in the colony rejected his proposals. Officials felt similarly. Forwarded to London, they died without trace. A similar fate befell his earlier project for another Victoria Company and another Victoria Company. Twice sent to London and twice rejected, a third version had failed as recently as 1839. So Sullivan's persistent colonial failures should have warned him against repeating them. A sterner warning against such ventures sounded from his Irish heritage. His family's pretensions to the chieftainship, the Gaelic chieftainship, as the O'Sullivan Moor, faced a conundrum. The ancestral O'Sullivans had surrendered their Munster lands not once, but twice. In the 13th century, they were driven by Anglo-Normans from their traditional territories into the fastnesses of the Kerry peninsulas. There they splintered into septs of ever smaller regions, each with its own headship. Benjamin's immediate forebears of Dunkerron underwent a second dispossession under the Tudors in the 16th century, and by the 17th, with few acres to their name and relocated to Cork, the O'Sullivan Moor title was more nominal than real. A century later, some chieftains abandoned old homelands altogether. A few scions left for Spain and France, cherishing the hope of returning victorious and renewed. Benjamin Sullivan's ancestors held on, and their fortunes revived in the 18th century. They descended socially, yet proclaimed their loyalty to the new regime, and soon looked outward to the broader British Empire and exchanged Irish anonymity for Indian prosperity. They carved out a crucial sub-imperial role for Ireland as a centre for expansion into India that bypassed London and yet bound the British Empire together. Benjamin Sullivan's great-grandfather, the merchant Philip O'Sullivan Moore, oversaw the transition from Kerry castles to Cork counting houses. His illegitimate son Lawrence won and lost 2 fortunes under the East India Company while exercising enormous influence in London as its long-time director and sometimes chairman. Next, a legitimate son, a first Benjamin, became a Cork attorney and held a string of legal offices. He enabled 3 sons to win Indian fortunes and retain them. His eldest son, a second Benjamin, was called to the Irish bar by the King's Inn in 1770 and soon set up practice in Madras, became Advocate General and then Justice of the Supreme Court, when he was also knighted. He also exceeded as the O'Sullivan Moor. Now, these honours all laid ahead of him when he sired a third son called Benjamin. This Benjamin proved to be an exemplary colonizer. Born out of wedlock in India, his judge father purchased him an army commission. He became a decorated veteran of the Peninsular Wars, fighting, of course, Napoleon, and in New South Wales from 1828, a pastoralist on thousands of acres in the colony's New England region, and a dutiful head of family. He also became a country magistrate during the 1830s before being retrenched, and again in the 1840s and 50s. Major Sullivan was well connected. 2 uncles were British India millionaires who returned from India not to Ireland, but to England, and made England the scene and proof of their success. Both entered the House of Commons. One, John, became Under-Secretary for the Colonies, and the other obtained a political baronetcy. Here, clan history of defeat and dispossession only confirmed his disconnection with place. Neither Ireland nor India offered O'Sullivan a homeland. He might have looked back to both as he made a new, uneasy one in Australia. New Caledonia's fate was to become simply the latest place he had turned his attention to, although not one he ever saw, as far as I can tell. Deep Irish echoes can be found in Sullivan's project for New Caledonia, as well as contemporary capitalist values. Clan Sullivans were objects of past conquest. Benjamin Sullivan might be the agent of future conquest. Compare the Gaelic traditions surrounding the succession of chieftains and Sullivan's vision for the island and its control. The prospectus of 1842 arranged structural power by means of a joint stock company, but that actually emulated the clan structure and offered Sullivan the potential to imitate his O'Sullivan Moor ancestors. Locating the authority of a chief in an individual acting alongside a group of like-minded supporters had very similar expectations and processes for both the clan and the companies. The company embodied the clan's territorial functions of acquisition, exploitation and defence. Like autocratic clan governance, the prospectus envisaged the total control of its enterprises. Company territory, like that of a clan, would be held from an overlord, and the London board was constituted along the lines of a regional ree or king. The same metaphor made the board of directors, the Dauphin, the electoral college of close associates of the chair. Shareholders filled the role of the Fina, the outer group of interested members of the productive community. Company meetings, routine and special, election of chairs and directors, and shared ownership of productive assets, all these mirrored the corporate organisation that was implicit in the clan. Local managers were the warriors, and workers of many degrees served as foot soldiers and labourers. More complex still, the prospectus assumed that every islander community could be looked at as a tour, a term both tribal and territorial in Ireland, connecting people to place. And thus the Gaelic model viewed New Caledonia as a regional or provincial kingdom of a clustered tour along traditional lines. But of course no one in the British Empire thought this way. Moreover, reliance on a colonisation company sidelined the Privy Council as much as it did the Imperial Parliament. Sullivan's own situation left him little influence to wield and less money to invest. Socially, his illegitimacy undermined his membership of the Dauphin as well as his prospects within the company. Financially, his near relatives had shown no interest in him for decades, and he had not become wealthy in New South Wales. Personal profit was necessarily on his mind, although he hardly made an obvious grab for this new form of power. His prospectuses sought some reward for the work of several years. He asked for the cost of his return to England to lay his project before ministers and the British public, and he offered his services in any capacity. Either way, he needed the Crown's, the company's, and the clan's patronage. Benjamin Sullivan's prospectus of 1842 invites inquiry into if and how the Celtic survived in the modern world, indeed, whether it can be found outside the academy. Celtic character, it becomes clear, needs only to be identified, and its extent, strength, and depth determined. Above all, the authenticity of the impulse determined. The historiography of the British Empire, however, makes it clear, with hindsight, that the transfer of New Caledonia to a private company was at best a contemporary possibility. As a Celtic signifier, it was a modern illusion. In Sullivan's case, the Gaelic impulse was diluted, dissipated to the point of absent. Sic transit Celtica mundi. The O'Sullivan Moor title went the same way. Benjamin's great-grandfather Philip not only traded out of Cork, he married out of Catholicism. Only the vestigial title remained. And even that had been reinvented in the wake of the Tudor Wars and Stuart plantations, no longer passing to the strongest under Gaelic tanistry, but to the eldest by English primogeniture. Subsequent generations confirmed the trend. Benjamin Sullivan's father and grandfather were common lawyers, whose professions of attorney and barrister played them at the forefront of the new English-Irish order. Defeated by the English conqueror, they embraced the new dispensation. Irish dispossession and Indian and Australian transplantation took their toll. O'Sullivan's status waned as Celtic allegory. Benjamin Sullivan might be a survivor of a Celtic past, but gave no sign of understanding its implications. He certainly didn't appreciate the irony of his Gaelic origins in his proposal to colonize New Caledonia for the United Kingdom. His prospectus displayed personal pragmatism dressed up as modern imperialism, rather than any tradition linked to an ancient Gaelic legal and social order. Indeed, Sullivan exemplified the range of Irish networks at work around the British Empire. He also represents their dispersion, not only out of Ireland, but between India and Australia, and potentially around the Pacific. His story supplies a case study of Irish heredity surrendered to Anglo-Indian identity, and of ancient traditions lost amidst modern processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. So do you have questions for Peter?
Thank you, Peter. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. It makes me think of something. So my intervention with the microphone is partially a question and partially a comment. The question part is, what do you think would have happened if that proposition had met any kind of success? Do you imagine that something official would have maybe taken place, or would have a con man society scheme taken place? Because there is a very French example of that happening in what is called La Nouvelle-France, New France, in Papua New Guinea in the 1870s. And that enterprise comes from a Breton gentleman of old Breton nobility. He's called the Marquis de Ré. His real name was Charles de Breuil. And a bogus French colonization of New Guinea collected enormous amounts of money in France at the time, with people buying land and being sent on pretty bad boats all the way to New Guinea, disembarking in the Bismarck archipelago and eventually finding out that there was nothing there. And so this is a tragedy that impacted hundreds of families, but it's it's strikingly similar in a way, and it comes from an Irishman on one side and from another Breton gentleman on the other side. So it's kind of peculiar, since we've been, highlighting links between those two things. That was my comment. Thank you.
Yep, there's a lot of company flotations in the Australian context and in New Zealand, which had the whiff of scam about them, and some fell by the wayside, just died. Others boomed, but they were always, watched carefully and suspiciously. Generally, the success of a thing like the Australian Agricultural Company, which is still operating since 1824, and even the South Australian Company, which was more or less a one-man company, they depended on the directors and shareholders watching each other over the shoulders. We didn't get far enough with the Victoria Company proposal to know who was going to be involved and what kind of people would have invested or become directors. It's very much a preliminary statement. In fact, a prospectus is usually something which a group of potential shareholders and directors put their heads together to organise. This is a one-man suggestion. So I don't think he had much chance. But when he proposed it, his uncle was still one of the leading influences in British politics. he died in 1839, right at the wrong moment. And that may well have sort of stopped a kind of momentum developing. But even in the colony, he was just simply told, this won't work, you won't get the money. The New Zealand company floated with £400,000. He wanted 3 million. So he may just have been a little mad. But there's nobody suggests for a moment that there's a scam, but then no money changes hands. So, you know, as soon as a pound was put up, you'd say, oh, well, what's going to happen next? But it didn't get even that far. So it's pretty much a kite-flying exercise, I think. Yeah.
Perhaps it was the Elon Musk of his day.
There was a Musk about him.
A couple of questions. One, what is it that would have attracted investors? What would be the source of the income? Were there resources that had been identified? Second question, we know that the French eventually take possession in 1853, not long after this. Was there some toing and froing that either led Sullivan or the French to become interested?
What was the first question?
What was the resources?
Oh, yes. The resources were essentially guesswork. He had quite clearly done his research. He'd read everything that had been written, but it was everything that had been written. It wasn't necessarily the truth or accurate or, you know, true of the whole island or assisting from part of the island. But he had detailed estimates, you know, down to the last £20 on how every aspect would be exploited, and mining was big, and he had talk of, you know, equipment to be bringing in, and so he had some sense of the possibilities and a range of possibilities. But again, we're back to the prospectus idea and the kite flying idea. I mean, he'd never been there. You know, it's astonishing in that sense too. And the other question. Oh, the French. Oh, well, the third manifestation of his proposal followed about a month after a report came from a newspaper in London that the French were making a move. So that turns up in Sydney, and a month later he's having another go, a third proposal. So there is a hint in which this is about who's going to get there first, and this is his proposition to the British Empire, you should get there first. And it wasn't taken up because the Brits had just finished settling New Zealand. There were complications and what have you there. It went on for years. And there was a distinct feeling that, you know, we're not doing this again. You know, that was a very strong feeling. They didn't want to annex New Zealand in the first place. And so when they did, it was a case of, well, that's all there'll be. Meanwhile, there was a change of government, and the Tories weren't interested in doing anything in those directions anyway. So it would have gone quiet for a few years. Perhaps the change of government later in the decade might have brought different news, but by then he'd given up. Yeah. Peter Cush. No? Ah, the young lady. No.
Thank you very much. Very rich and very, very interesting. The problem with labour, did he do a whole lot of calculations on that? Because I thought the reference to India was very, very interesting. I mean, transportation ends to the eastern states in 1840. Yep. 3940. There's a significant number of collapses of companies, as you pointed out, yeah, and huge labour shortages. So had he done his homework on labour?
Well, he had lots of good numbers, you know, how many people it would take to do how many things and what that would cost. It's all in the estimates. But his attitude was that the French, you see, wouldn't be up to, and the British wouldn't be up to all the humidity and the heat and the trial. So bring in people from the East Indian territories. He named Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, he named other places as well. And these people would do the work, and after 10 years they'd be given a plot of land and they could stay. But by then, you see, the British or the French would have acclimatised and they'd be doing the work themselves. Well, that's just a ticket to a kind of slavery on paper, arrangement. We can all imagine how unpleasant it would have been for the workers. So, but yes, he had the numbers. I mean, he'd worked it through. Yeah. But there's a hint of pie in the sky about it. Hello.
I knew you were waiting for my question.
I was waiting for it. I was hoping for it.
Actually, I had a few questions, so I try to keep it short. My first question was, do you think Sullivan's identity as both Irish and a British colonizer created any conflict in his plans for New Caledonia?
The fact that he was Irish and it was a British project?
Yeah.
No, he had probably... I feel that he's so third level Irish that it's almost in irrelevance. He has become a member of a broader community. In fact, he's become a member of the New South Wales community, which is already a kind of mixture of things, and it has its own sense of who it wants to be and where it wants to go. My feeling is that his Irish sense is not strong in himself. He is half Indian, I believe. He was born out of wedlock to a senior legal official before he'd even married. I can only assume it was a local woman who was the mother. And certainly the father's will gives him enough money to buy his next commission in the army, but there's to be no more. So I think he's on the outer anyway. I don't think there's a conflict because I don't think he really set up a profoundly Irish position. He was running a sort of broadly British Empire adventure.
Thank you. And my second question was, Sullivan's effort ultimately failed, but what lasting impact, if any, did his attempts at colonization have on New Caledonia or British interests in the Pacific?
That's quite a big question. The colony has watched the islands generally for decades. And there's talk of sandalwood trading and missionaries and this voyage and that voyage and what have you. And there are some quite negative reports from different islands about the treatment that Europeans got. So there's a very light, casual, occasional reportage through newspapers. There's very little, next to no official correspondence with the governor about this situation. He forwarded Sullivan's applications to London with quite stern remarks. So I think the governor was saying to London, this guy has asked me to send this, but, we know what you'll do with it. There's no... when he makes his proposal, there has been very little interest or impact. Afterwards, in the decade between the proposal and the annexation by Napoleon III, there is a mounting interest because there's more trading and more missionaries, but government stays out of it. The colonial government takes no interest. It occasionally scolds captains of ships for misbehaving and things, but there's no official implication. In the case of New Zealand, because of the traders and the missionaries, the British government appointed a consul. No such interest was taken in the islands. Even Fiji, two leaders begged the British government to take them over, and not until the 1870s did they do it. They were so reluctant to get involved. So I think it's fair to say that even after the proposal, the public profile of New Caledonia in the New South Wales community might have been a little higher, but there was no interest in becoming involved with it or engaged with it, which left it open to France to make that choice. That's as I read it, certainly.
And I had one last question.
Yep.
It's more about how he perceived indigenous people. So what is Sullivan's characterizations of the indigenous Caledonians tells us about colonial attitudes at the time? And do you see parallels with how indigenous people were treated in other British colonies?
I'm afraid to have to report that my opinion and impression would be that all Indigenous peoples were treated practically the same, which was not very well at all, by all colonising groups, as well as they might dress it up with public relations statements and so forth. The case of South Australia is almost the neatest because it's the worst. There was an official order to make sure you looked after the Aboriginal people and their association with their property. And behind the scenes, they all agreed that they don't have any property. So official order, look after their property, and everyone behind the scenes says, no property to look after. And so you just worked around it and they were treated poorly. And that sort of sleight of hand is common right through Africa and Australia. And I guess to an extent New Zealand is a little different. There was a much stronger fight back. But remember, quite early, they actually come to a treaty, which is at least a nominal piece of paper to say, we're together in this. It didn't work out particularly well, but so there is a public relations game and a political game going on. And unfortunately, Indigenous people tend always to be the losers. I think that is just simply the very ugly truth. Yes, sir. One more.
Another go, Peter.
Yeah. Why not? Oh, Pamela had her hand up.
Inevitably, it's a question. Inevitably, it's a question about Celtic language. What do you think he was on about? If he's so far distant from his Irish roots, what is that ridiculous, misspelt and undoubtedly mispronounced garbage about the Board of Directors doing?
Are you referring to that?
Well, that too, but no, your Board of Directors.
Oh, that's just me flying a kite. But we're talking about structural power, and, you know, a clan is a structured power arrangement, so it's a corporation. So I was just comparing notes.
Why is he using...
He didn't.
Oh, he didn't do that.
It's me flying the...
Oh, well, I've got a bone to pick with you later.
Yeah. No.
Sorry, Jeff.
Yeah. It wasn't exactly Foucault, but it was an attempt to analyse structural power.
How did Sullivan propose that the British Crown obtain sovereignty?
That's the big game, yeah. He just said, well,
I mean,
it's the same as
in New
Zealand.
South Wales, it was considered that it was settled land because there were no inhabitants, in a sense.
Yeah.
But he talks about the savages,
yeah.
but he talks about people being there.
This isn't a terra nullius exercise at all.
No.
No. But he said the British Crown can have the sovereignty in the island just as it did the sovereignty in New Zealand. But what he didn't say was the sovereignty in New Zealand was obtained incrementally, regrettably, against government policy. They tried by appointing a consul, then they allowed a treaty, and then they said, well, what the heck, we'll take it. So it's a very ambiguous statement about how you acquired the sovereignty over the island of New Caledonia. You know, do it the way you did it before, which was itself dubious.
One way, of course, is conquest.
Well, yeah, no, we don't use that word. No. I thought you might like to know, just to, assuming there's nobody else, what happened to the title of O'Sullivan Moore? Because it has passed, whoops, there we are, it's passed to a Californian doctor. And he was elected by his peers in 2014 after his brother had been the O'Sullivan Moore for 10 years. And this is the bit that I'm going to close with. They live in France in a very fine chateau with an Irish name, Dunderry.